My last video, entitled Mad Albert McInnes, was about a particularly brutal sexual predator who ultimately graduated from bullying and assault to murder. My interest in that story was largely due to the fact that I had a number of connections to it, and indeed to McInnes, who I had the misfortune to encounter on a number of occasions. When I was tying up loose ends in my research, I discovered a tragic and violent twist which took me to Allison Street in Glasgow. Arriving there for me was something of a shock, because it reminded me of another terrible event that occurred there which I had connections to. So I decided to make a video about the Allison Street murders. If you haven't seen my Mad Albert McInnes video, you can easily access it by clicking on the link below. If you don't want to do that, you can access it by simply searching on YouTube against Mad Albert McInnes. In any event, if you wish to support this channel, or if you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe. Your comments are also greatly appreciated. So let us begin. Around 3:15 on 30th December 1969, as light was beginning to fail, three desperate men, Howard Wilson, Ian Donaldson and John Sim, arrived in Linwood on the outskirts of Glasgow. They were driving a green Ford Corsair belonging to Donaldson and were intending to rob the Linwood branch of the Clydesdale Bank. This would not be their first robbery either. A few months earlier, on 16th July 1969, the three, accompanied by a getaway driver, Archie McGeechy, entered the British Linen Bank in Williamwood, Renfrewshire, armed with a Vostok semi-automatic pistol and plastic bottles of ammonia, and wearing stocking masks. They rounded up customers and staff, tied them up, and then relieved the bank of over £20,000. I can only imagine the stress and tension of carrying out a bank robbery. It's not something you can do a course on at college, and a lot of things can go wrong. Consequently, in their haste, they left a bag behind. It contained an additional £4.5 grand. To put this into perspective, £20,000 in 1969 is worth £325,000 today. So they left the modern day equivalent of £70,000 behind. That would have made for a very interesting conversation at gang headquarters that evening. Nevertheless, they got away with a lot of money. Some was used to pay off debts and some was invested in new businesses. Wilson, who had a greengrocer's shop at Cathcart Road in the south side of Glasgow, opened a second one in Duke Street. Very soon, however, the money was gone and talk turned to a second robbery. The undoubted leader of this gang was Wilson, aged 31, an ex-police officer. His accomplices, Donaldson, a former prison officer, and Sim, also an ex-police officer, were all, on the face of it, pillars of society. They were respectable family men with wives and young children. Wilson resigned from the force a year earlier after 10 years of service, after it became apparent to him that his prospects of promotion had vanished, following a blunder when he was acting as turnkey at the police cells in Glasgow. Whilst he didn't exactly leave under a cloud, there is evidence that he felt bitter at the way he was treated. Following his departure from the force, he had opened his shop named The Orchard at 1043 Cathcart Road near Allison Street. By mid-69 he was in financial difficulty. This may be the point at which the idea of robbery became a topic of conversation with the three friends. It's not clear how they recruited McGeechy, their getaway driver, on the first robbery. There were a number of things that were different in the second robbery. I believe that some of the differences led to the tragedy in Allison Street. In the first place, only Wilson, Sim and Donaldson took part. McGeechy, their getaway driver, was absent. That's a big twist in this story, but more on that later. However, his absence would have put more pressure on them, because there was nobody sitting outside to look after the car whilst the robbery was taking place. Secondly, when they pushed their way into the Clydesdale Bank, they were not wearing masks. They'd worn stocking masks during the first robbery. I've never seen an explanation for this omission. It might have just been bravado, but I think a more likely explanation is that in a state of high stress they simply forgot. Even after one job, they were still amateurs and were undoubtedly extremely agitated and nervous. As with the first robbery, they had the Vostok pistol. They also carried knives. They used these weapons to intimidate and subdue staff and customers. Everything would have been hurry, 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 living on the edge of panic. There wasn't a huge amount of paper money, but there was, for some reason, a large cachet of silver coins, shillings, half-crowns, etc., not sterling silver. They decided to take the coins as well as the notes, and this decision undoubtedly contributed in a very big way to what happened later. They fled the bank, weighed down with the coins, and drove off towards the city in the green Corsair. The drive would have taken about 25 minutes. They could have driven to a lock-up, which they rented, and left the car and the loot there for a few days to let the hue and cry die down. But for some inexplicable reason chose to drive to Wilson's flat at 51 Allison Street, just round the corner, unfortunately, from Craig Street police station. They parked in a nearby street and walked the short distance to the flat. This required them to cross Craig Street, and perhaps unsurprisingly, at that very moment, a car from the police station stopped at the junction. Sitting in the front seats, staring out at them, were Inspector Andrew Hyslop and Police Constable John Sillars. Hyslop knew Howard Wilson from his days on the force and was very suspicious of the three men crossing in front of them, carrying two heavy cases and a third with a heavy metal box hoisted on his shoulder. The two officers observed the men enter the close at number 51 Allison Street. Hyslop was convinced that the men were involved in some crime, although news of the robbery had not yet reached him. He ordered Constable Sillars to watch the close whilst he went back to the station for reinforcements. During his short absence, Wilson came out, ostensibly on his way to the shop across the road to get milk. He had a brief conversation with Sillars and learned that he had been ordered to stand guard. There are conflicting accounts about what happened next. In one, Wilson bought his milk and returned to the flat, followed shortly by the inevitable bang on the door. In another account, Wilson came out of the shop just as Hyslop returned with reinforcements, and the two men briefly exchanged greetings, this being followed by accusations of wrongdoing by Hyslop and denials from Wilson. In this second version, which I think is more credible, Howard Wilson accompanied the police, now numbering 5, to the tiny one-bedroom flat and let them in. Sim, who had been sitting on one of the cases sipping beer from a can, was surprised. Donaldson was petrified. The cases were in the lounge and were quickly opened to reveal cash, but the metal box was nowhere to be seen. As I said, the flat was very small, and all the rooms were accessed from the hallway. Officers went into the lounge, kitchen, bedroom and bathroom searching for the metal box. Then Hyslop returned to the hall and found himself looking down the barrel of the Vostok semi-automatic pistol held by Wilson. Sim and Donaldson were in the lounge as the massacre began. Now, a brief but important digression. I don't know whether their interest in shooting was a result of their interest in robbery, but at some point they joined a Glasgow gun club. This is where my connections lie. Although I was just a boy when they started their criminal activities, I later became a member of the same club and became friends with the then chairman Max Miller and his wife Allison. Max had been chairman at the time of the robberies. I'll return to this later. Sadly, Max passed away a few years ago, so I can't make fresh inquiries. Now we have to talk a little about the gun. It was actually a Margolin Vostok, a Soviet-made semi-automatic target pistol. It was a pretty good target pistol despite the fact that Margolin had been blind when he designed it. This particular model fired .22 long and would have had a 10-round magazine. There were also 6-round magazines. Earlier models fired short .22s. Also, some models were not equipped with a safety. This one was. According to the press, the pistol had been purchased legally from the president of the club, Max Miller. This differs from the account I got years after the event from Max, who told me that they had joined the club but were not full members, and that the pistol in question belonged to the club and was one of several available for use on the premises by non-firearm certificate holders. He said that they had breached club security and were able to surreptitiously remove the pistol for robbery purposes and then return it. Now back to that claustrophobic little flat on Allison Street. In the hall, staring at the muzzle of that pistol, Inspector Hyslop, who had firearm training, knew that his life was hanging by a thread. He tried to reason with the gunman. Wilson ignored his pleas and squeezed the trigger. There was a click. The media would later report that the gun had jammed, but that couldn't have been the case. Cocked and locked semi-automatics don't jam on the first pull of the trigger. There are two likely explanations for the pistol not going off: a faulty round or a failure by the shooter to disengage the safety. I've fired many thousands of .22 rounds and they are very, very reliable. However, people are less so, particularly people in highly stressful situations, and they don't come much more stressful than the one that Wilson found himself in. So I've gone for the second option: not a jam, not a faulty round, but a failure to disengage the safety. I think that the gun was loaded and ready when they robbed the bank, but its purpose then was to intimidate, not to kill, and so the safety had been engaged to avoid accidents. When Wilson pulled the trigger in that tiny little hall, he'd left his safety catch unsafe. He'd have realised that immediately and would have remedied it with a simple movement of his thumb and a quick reset of the hammer. The whole action would have taken about a second. Enough time for Hyslop to grab for it, but not enough time for him to stop the shot. The gun went off. The report would have been absolutely deafening in the small flat and was heard by people living above. Everyone in the flat would have known that a gun was in play, and the officers would have immediately realised that they were in mortal danger. Hyslop, in his vain attempt to grab the firearm, had diverted it from his head. The bullet hit him in the neck, travelled through muscle and lodged near his spine. He went down, out of the fight, but still fully conscious. The massacre had begun. As the inspector hit the floor, PC Sillars dashed into the bathroom and started to radio for help. He was the only one with a handset. Portable police radios were rare in 1969. As he slammed the bathroom door, Donaldson was fleeing from the flat in panic and terror, and PC Barnett came out of the kitchen only to be shot at point-blank range in the head. As blood sprayed from the fatal wound, he tumbled to the floor, coming to rest next to Hyslop. DC McKenzie arrived in the hall just as Barnett was shot. He had no time to retreat as Wilson fired a third shot. He was hit in the head, but the shot was high and furrowed along the top of his skull. Not enough to kill, but enough to put him down. Realising this, Wilson stepped over Hyslop's body and carelessly put another bullet into Mackenzie's head, killing the helpless man instantly. In the silence that followed, he became aware that Sillars was in the bathroom calling for help. He quickly crossed to the bathroom and tried to get the door open, calling Sim for assistance, but Sim was paralysed with shock and didn't respond. Sillars was able to hold the door shut. Wilson seemed to give up and turned his attention back to the hall and the three bodies lying there in their own blood. He noticed that Hyslop was still moving and stepped over the other bodies to reach him with the intention of finishing him off. He stood straddling the helpless officer, pointed the pistol at his head and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. This time the gun had actually jammed. As he fought to clear the stoppage, Detective Constable Campbell, who had been in the lounge, seized his opportunity, rushed into the hall and jumped upon Wilson, and a struggle for the weapon began. It was a life and death struggle. Wilson was a strong, well-built man, but in the end Campbell won and disarmed him, and the killer found himself staring at the muzzle of his murder weapon. Sillars helped with the arrest, and reinforcements forced their way into the flat a few seconds later. It was all over. The whole event had lasted for about a minute, from the first shot to the disarming. Its repercussions for the victims and their families, however, would last considerably longer. Hyslop would survive and eventually return to work, but left the force permanently not long afterwards. Police Constable McKenzie was dead, and Police Constable Barnett would succumb to his wounds a few days later. Pandemonium ensued as ambulances arrived and police investigators descended on the scene, and bewildered neighbours and excited reporters congregated in the street outside the close. In the midst of this, Howard Wilson's wife arrived home with infant in pram and toddler by her side, apparently completely oblivious to events. She later claimed to have had no knowledge of her husband's criminal activities, but I greatly doubt that. Donaldson, who had fled the scene when the shooting started and had driven off in the Corsair, eventually just went home where police officers were waiting to arrest him. Ultimately, Wilson claimed full responsibility for the murders, and the Crown accepted this, so Sim and Donaldson were convicted only of the robberies. This was a deviation from the existing rules of art and part responsibility in Scotland. Normally, as all of them were engaged in a common purpose, namely bank robbery, they would all have been equally guilty of a murder which occurred in the course of their criminal enterprise. For example, one of them shooting a policeman during a getaway. The Crown made an exception because of the particular circumstances here. I first heard of this case whilst I was studying criminal law at Strathclyde University in 1977. I had no recollection of the crime before then. The aftermath. Sim, the junior partner at 22, and Donaldson, Wilson's best friend, aged 31, Wilson was actually the best man at Donaldson's wedding, were very lucky to avoid murder convictions, and they were sent to prison for 12 years for the bank robberies. Wilson, 31, was also lucky because for centuries the penalty for murder in the UK was death, but the death sentence had been suspended in 1965 for 5 years, that is, until 1970. The year he was convicted for capital murder. However, during 1969, Parliament had voted to make the suspension permanent, and he was off the hook. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, and I'm sure never expected to taste freedom again. The wives of all three told a local paper that they would wait for their husbands. Talk is cheap, however, and soon after his incarceration, Julia Wilson divorced her husband and took the children and headed south. I've not been able to find any trace of them in Scotland. As far as I can see, Wendy Donaldson did hang around, but again I have not been able to find her or indeed her husband. Eileen Sim divorced John Sim and he remarried in the 80s. For reasons perhaps completely unconnected with the events in Allison Street, he turned to drink and died from alcohol liver disease in 2004. Howard Wilson, believing that he would die inside, seems to have got stuck into prison life with some gusto, taking part in a riot and an attempted escape. His activities resulted in an additional 7 years on top of his life sentence. He also wrote a book. It's called Angels of Death and is out of print. I've not read it, so I have no idea if it is any good. If you want to judge for yourself and are prepared to shell out over £40, you can pick it up on Amazon second hand. On the Amazon site there is a single review of the book, and it's a very good review. However, it's signed by one H. Wilson. Judge for yourself. That might have been the end of Wilson's story had it not been for the election of Tony Blair as Prime Minister of the UK in 1997. He, in his questionable wisdom, made us signatories to the controversial European Human Rights Convention, putting us under the supervision of the European Court of Human Rights. And with a stroke of the Prime Minister's pen, a door opened for Wilson. So after serving 32 years, lawyers were able to convince the court that continued incarceration would breach his human rights, and consequently he was released in 2002. Though his wife had divorced him, he had retained the support of members of his family, and that support continued on his release, and consequently he was able to slip out of prison to a quiet life in a cottage in rural Perthshire. He remained there without further incident until his admission to a care home, where he died from pneumonia and Alzheimer's on 20th January 2023. That's where the story ended, but there is a loose end. What happened to McGeechy, the driver in the first robbery? He declined to take part in the second and vanished a few days before it was due to take place, never to be heard of from again. He was presumed dead, and that was that. If you have any further information, please get in touch. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope that you found the video about a very dark event in our history illuminating. Can I remind you to please hit the like button and also please share it and subscribe. My next video is entitled Raising the Dead.